Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little grittier. A time of dust, danger, and dried beans. We're heading west to the saloons, cook fires, and cracked plates of the American frontier. Forget the gunslingers and cowboy duels, Hollywood. Sold you. The real Wild West was full of tough meat, stale bread, spoiled beer, and a lot of questionable stew. So if you're still awake, dim the lights, get comfortable, and take a moment to like the video and subscribe, because we're about to taste what life was really like when your dinner came from a bullet, a bottle, or a boot. Asterisk when you walked into a saloon in the American West. You weren't entering a restaurant, and certainly not a place where the menu mattered. You were stepping into a haze of cigar smoke, spilled whiskey, and unwashed humanity. Food was rarely the draw. If anything was served, it was because the barkeep had a pot on the stove, not because anyone came in hungry. Most saloons weren't outfitted for dining. No kitchen staff, no tables set with silverware. At best, you got a tin plate, a wooden spoon, and a corner to sit in. Meals, if you could call them that, were improvised. Leftovers from last week were mixed with leftovers from yesterday, heated once in the morning and left simmering on a back flame until they burned or evaporated. You didn't ask for a menu because there wasn't one. You didn't ask what was in the stew because you didn't want to know. You just hoped there weren't too many bones. The bar wasn't polished. It was layered in grime. Spoons meant. Forks were rare. Knives were your own, pulled from your belt. And in that setting, the food, if you could stomach it, was less about nourishment and more about not collapsing after your third shot of gut-rot whiskey. Asterisk, if there was a holy trinity of food in the Wild West saloon, it wasn't steak, eggs, and coffee. It was salt pork, beans, and dry biscuits. 3 things you could store without refrigeration. 3 things that, if cooked long enough, wouldn't kill you. Salt pork was exactly what it sounds like. Pork packed in salt, so heavily cured it became rubbery. It was boiled to soften, fried to crisp, or just hacked and tossed into beans for flavor. The beans were cheap, came dry by the sack, and were easy to make in bulk. They simmered for hours, sometimes days, soaking up whatever grease was left. In the pot, and the biscuits, flat, heavy, and dry. Not fluffy, not warm. More like pale rocks than anything you'd call bread. There were no side dishes. No garnish. Your meal came with whatever utensils you had in your coat. You soaked your biscuit in whiskey if your teeth were bad. You salted the beans to cover the taste of age. And you never complained, because the alternative was riding another 100 miles to the next town with nothing but hardtack in your saddlebag. Asterisk. They called it stew, but it was more of a mystery. There was no recipe, no portioning, just one pot, one flame, and whatever ingredients hadn't spoiled yet. The pot itself sat blackened over the fire, iron sides crusted with past meals. It rarely got fully emptied, just added to. If meat was available, it was tossed in. Could be rabbit, could be beef, could be squirrel or possum, or something the cook found near the chicken coop. Bones and all. Vegetables? Maybe. A carrot here. A shriveled onion there. Potatoes if they hadn't gone green. But usually it was beans, a handful of flour for thickness, and bacon grease for taste. The broth was cloudy, the smell was strong, and the taste was forgettable. But in winter? Or after? A week of chewing jerky and cactus water? That stew was the best thing you'd ever tasted. Asterisk in the Wild West. Cold was seasonal, and preservation was guesswork. Without refrigeration, everything turned fast. Meat, butter, milk, even bread had a shelf life of hours once the sun rose. Ice boxes were rare, and ice itself was a privilege. For most frontier saloons, food was stored on open shelves in cellars, or just hung in sacks from ceiling beams, where rats couldn't reach them, but flies could when a fresh kill was brought in, maybe a deer, a cow, or even a pig. It had to be carved and cooked quickly. Whatever wasn't eaten right away was salted or smoked. But even that didn't guarantee safety. You could boil meat all morning and still find the middle gray and sour by evening dot, and yet nothing went to waste. Mold was cut away. Spoiled butter was mixed into batter. Milk that had gone sour was still poured into stew. The attitude was simple. If it didn't move, and it didn't smell too strong, it was dinner. Cowboys joked that the strongest stomachs survived the trail. But deep down, they knew it wasn't a joke. If you didn't eat what was in front of you, you didn't eat at all. And out there, you couldn't afford to be picky. Asterisk, if there was one thing you could count on in a Wild West saloon, it was coffee. Not good coffee. Not fresh coffee, but hot, black, and bitter. A brew so strong it could stand a spoon straight up in the cup. Coffee was made by boiling coarse grounds in a soot-blackened pot over open fire. No filters, no fancy beans. Just a handful of whatever came in the last trade shipment, sometimes mixed with chicory, sometimes with crushed acorns, sometimes even recycled from yesterday's pot. The ground settled like gravel at the bottom. You learned quickly not to drink that last sip. For cowboys, drifters, and gamblers, it was more than caffeine. It was ritual. A mug of coffee meant you were still alive, still moving, still ahead of the worst of the trail. Men clutched there. Tin mugs in the cold dawn, steam rising around sunken eyes. The taste? Nobody really described it. They just drank dot, and in the quiet hours before sunrise, or after the night's last hand of poker, that awful coffee was the one comfort they could. Count on dot asterisk whiskey in the Wild West wasn't just a drink. It was an institution, a remedy, a replacement for food, water, and courage. Sometimes it was the only thing you consumed in a day. Real whiskey, when available, was strong. But most saloon whiskey? It was a witch's brew, made from neutral. Grain spirits mixed with burnt sugar, tobacco juice, kerosene, or even snake venom. The taste was harsh, the burn immediate, and the effects unpredictable. Men drank it like water, especially when food ran short. It numbed pain, quieted hunger, and gave you the strength to bluff through a losing poker hand or stagger back onto your horse. Saloons advertised their whiskey with bravado, but nobody really trusted it. The joke was that if your whiskey didn't blind you, it just made you stronger, and it wasn't only for drinking. Cuts? Pour whiskey on it. Cough? Whiskey and molasses. Toothache? Swish and spit. It was the medicine chest of the frontier. Even children were dosed with it. Small sips for fevers, or to help them sleep through nights filled with coyotes. And gunshots in a land where food was often suspect and water was worse. Whiskey was certainty, however dangerous that certainty might be. Asterisk in the frontier towns of the Wild West, bread wasn't soft. It didn't come sliced. It wasn't warm. And fragrant like your grandmother's kitchen. Bread was tough, dense, sometimes stale before it ever reached your plate. Flour was expensive, and yeast unreliable. Most bakers, if a town had one, used soda or sourdough starters. The result was a loaf that was dry, flat, and coarse, baked in heavy pans or cast-iron Dutch ovens blackened by years of fire smoke. The crust, as hard as saddle leather, the inside, often gritty from flour not properly sifted. People broke bread with knives or axes. Some carried their own small saws. It was common to soak a hunk of bread in broth, whiskey, or even water just to get it soft enough to chew. If the bread grew mold, it was scraped off and eaten anyway. A clean loaf was a gift. A fresh one? Almost a myth. Many saloons served day-old bread alongside greasy stew or pickled eggs. And when they didn't, you ate crackers or hardtack, dry biscuit slabs that could outlive a horse. Cowboys even used stale bread as a tool to clean plates, plug leaky boots, or as a makeshift coaster for a hot mug. Bread was basic, boring, often unpleasant, but it was filling. And in the Wild West, that meant everything. Asterisk eggs were a rare treat in many frontier saloons. Chickens were hard to keep alive through rough weather, predators, and theft. And when eggs did arrive in town, they traveled far. Stuffed into crates packed with straw, jostled on rough trails, arriving cracked, dirty, or half-rotten, fresh eggs were precious, expensive, often reserved for the wealthier patrons, or saved for breakfast in private homes. What saloons served were more often pickled eggs, boiled hard, shoved into cloudy jars, filled with vinegar, salt, and whatever spices the barkeep could find. These eggs sat on the bar for weeks, floating, swollen, yellowed. They weren't eaten for pleasure. They were dares, snacks with a shot, or just something solid to soak up the whiskey. Some claimed they cured hangovers. Others claimed they caused them. If you bit into a pickled egg and found the center black, you didn't flinch. You just chewed. Faster. Because the next guy in line was already reaching for his, and there was no such thing as a refund. Asterisk canned food was one of the most revolutionary and dangerous additions to the Wild West diet. It brought the promise of vegetables, fruit, even meat, to places where nothing grew and game was scarce. But early canned goods came with a catch. They were often spoiled, contaminated, or dangerously canned in lead-sealed tins. Canned peaches were a prize. Canned oysters, a rare treat in saloons that could afford East Coast shipments. But most often it was canned tomatoes, beans, and stewed beef if the label hadn't worn off. Cowboys would scrape off rust with a knife, pry open the lid with a hammer or a bullet, and take a whiff. If it didn't smell like death, it was probably fine. Exploding cans weren't uncommon. Neither were bloated lids and metallic aftertastes. People ate them anyway, because a tin of anything beat another bowl of gray stew. The smarter saloons bought in bulk and cooked canned goods into other meals. The careless ones served straight from the tin. A bad can might just make you sick. A worse one might kill you. But in a land where food was never guaranteed, opening a tin meant gambling with your gut. And most folks were willing to take that bet. Asterisk, when you heard the word meat pie in a Wild West saloon, it didn't mean something elegant. This wasn't a dish served on fine china. It was a thick-crusted gamble, baked in iron pans, its contents as mysterious as the day's stew. Meat pies were cheap to make. Flour, lard, and water formed a tough crust that could hold nearly anything. Inside, usually ground or chopped leftovers. Yesterday's beef, possum from the morning hunt, or salted pork boiled soft. Sometimes there were onions, rarely a potato. The flavor depended entirely on what was found, caught, or scrounged that week. Saloons baked them in bulk. One large pan, sliced into wedges, served hot or cold, often eaten with bare hands, dripping fat onto the floorboards. Some pies were spicy, masking meat that had turned. Others were bland, relying on the crust alone to provide structure and calories. No one asked what meat they were eating, and no one wanted to know. The phrase tastes like chicken could mean anything from rabbit to raccoon, even horse, but a meat pie filled your belly. And if you were lucky, it kept you full through the coldest parts of the night. Asterisk, you couldn't miss it. It sat there in the corner like a quiet dare, the pickle barrel, huge, wooden, smelling of vinegar, brine, and something much older. Every saloon had one, whether they served real meals or just drinks. It was a holdover from the East, a relic. of tavern tradition and a practical way to keep vegetables from rotting. Inside floated cucumbers. Sure, but also carrots, onions, maybe even peppers or chunks of cabbage. All sliced or whole, all bobbing together in a murky stew of salt, herbs, and thyme. The brine was reused, replenished, and rarely thrown out. Over time, it thickened into something halfway between liquid and glue. A man might fish out a pickle. With his knife, spear a hunk of onion with his fork, or simply plunge his hand in if no one was watching. Pickles cut the burn of whiskey. They were sour, sharp, and packed with enough salt to keep you sweating through a desert ride. They were also rumored to settle the stomach after a night of bad stew or bad poker. For some, it was a comfort. For others, a punishment. Either way, the pickle barrel was always waiting. And whether you wanted one or not, eventually, everyone took a dip. Asterisk. If there was one thing that stuck to your ribs and stayed in your stomach, it was beans. Cowboys called them prairie pearls. They were the lifeblood of every chuckwagon, awning, house, and saloon kitchen. Cheap, filling, and shelf-stable, beans were served morning, noon, and night. At breakfast. Beans came lukewarm in yesterday's tin. By supper, they'd been boiled into a thick paste with whatever scraps of salt pork or drippings were left from the day. Spice? If you were lucky, a dash of pepper or chili powder. But most times, the flavor came from age and ash. You'd spoon them over stale biscuits or just eat them alone. One tin plate held close to your chest to conserve warmth. Cowboys had bean songs, bean jokes, bean complaints. They gave them nicknames: belly ballast, cowpoke caviar, gut gravel. But the truth was simple. No one could ride 100 miles without them. They gave energy. They gave warmth. And yes, they gave gas, but no one in a bunkhouse cared. Saloons kept pots on the back flame 24 hours a day, the contents thickening with every scoop. You'd get the same meal at midnight as you would at dawn. Beans weren't a dish. They were a way of life. Asterisk in the Wild West, coffee wasn't just a morning ritual. It was a necessity. But that didn't mean it tasted good. Most saloon coffee was made from reused grounds, boiled again and again until the color held, but the flavor fled. The pot stayed on the fire all day, collecting char and dust, thickening like tar as the sun went down. Barkeeps used anything to stretch a batch. Crushed acorns, roasted peas, even burnt bread. Some used old socks as filters. Others scooped out the grounds with their fingers. If a rat fell into the pot, most didn't notice. If they did, they just boiled it longer. Customers rarely complained. They drank to stay awake, to stave off hunger, or just to feel something warm in their gut. Coffee was poured into tin cups, chipped and scorched from long use. It scorched your tongue, blackened your teeth, and sometimes made your stomach turn. Still, it was better than water. Because water came from the same river that horses bathed in coffee, no matter how foul, at least had been boiled. Asterisk not. All saloon food was swallowed. Some of it was chewed and spit. Chewing tobacco was more than a vice. It was a fixture at every bar, poker table, and front porch across the Wild West. It came in greasy pouches, dense bricks, or long twisted ropes, and it was often stronger than anything you'd drink. Men chewed it to pass time, kill hunger, or calm nerves before a duel. It made your mouth water, numbed your tongue, and stained your teeth a muddy brown. Saloon floors were sticky with spit, blackened with years of expectoration. Spittoons overflowed. The smell was sour and sweet, sharp as vinegar, and old boots dotted. Wasn't just the men. Some women chewed discreetly, behind fans or in the dark corners of saloons. Children mimicked their fathers, hiding plugs behind their backs. Tobacco was sometimes chewed alongside meals. between bites, during card games, or simply while watching the door, waiting for trouble. You didn't eat it, but you kept it in your cheek like a flavor you couldn't quite get rid of. Asterisk in the days before refrigeration. Saloon kitchens were a battlefield against rot. Meat spoiled quickly, especially in summer heat. But hungry cowboys were picky, and saloon cooks knew how to mask a smell. You'd walk in and catch a whiff of something sharp, like old socks and vinegar. That was the meat. Maybe beef, maybe goat, maybe something unspoken. It had been hung too long in a smokehouse, or sat too long in a barrel of brine. Cooks soaked it in whiskey, rubbed it with pepper, or simmered it in beans until it lost its voice. If the meat was green, you scraped that part off. If it moved, you cut deeper. Bones might be soft. Gristle might squeak. But it filled your stomach. And in the West, that was enough. Customers ate quickly, and saloon owners didn't ask questions. Even the dogs outside learned not to beg. They knew better than anyone what went in and what came back out. Asterisk. Ask for butter in a saloon, and you'd get a laugh. Real butter was rare, expensive, and quick to spoil. It had to be churned fresh, stored cool, and protected from flies, dirt, and every stray cat in town. Most cowboys never saw real butter. What they got instead was lard, rendered pig fat. Pale, soft, greasy, and shelf-stable. It was spread on biscuits, melted into beans, and used to fry everything from eggs to shoe leather. It came in crocks, buckets, or just scooped from a barrel by the cook's bare hands. Lard didn't taste like much. It coated your mouth. It clung to your beard. It made your fingers shine in the lantern light. But it kept you full longer than anything else on the table. When meals were thin, a spoonful of lard on toast was dinner. Sometimes they'd mix it with molasses or sugar, call it poor man's frosting, and slap it on day-old cornbread. And if it went rancid, well, you'd know, and eat it anyway. Asterisk thick, slow, and endlessly sticky. Molasses was one of the few sweet things a saloon might have on hand, and it lasted nearly forever. Unlike sugar, which was expensive and hard. To keep dry, molasses came in dense, oozing jugs that could survive months on a dusty shelf. It was poured over cornbread, stirred into bitter coffee, or mixed with lard to create a faux dessert. It gave life to sour biscuits and was sometimes used to sweeten whiskey that tasted too much like gun oil. You didn't need much. A spoonful went a long way. Cowboys called it black gold, though not always kindly. It stuck to your teeth. It glued shut the tops of jugs. It trapped flies, dirt, even the occasional button. Getting it on your fingers meant your next 10 hard hands would stick together, but it was comfort. A rare softness in a life of leather, dust, and noise. Kids licked it off knives. Old men swore it cured coughs. And when times got really bad, a saloon might serve it straight from the jar with a side of bread crusts and call it pie. Asterisk in the Wild West, dairy didn't come easy. Fresh milk spoiled fast, and refrigeration was a dream yet to come. So what you often got was sour, milk turned thick, lumpy, and tangy from age and heat. But it wasn't thrown out. It was used. Cooks baked with it, poured it into cornbread batter, or mixed it into biscuits for a little extra rise. It was even drunk straight when nothing better was on hand. They called it clabber, a soft, curdled yogurt-like mess. That slid down slow and hit your gut hard. Cheese was rarer still. Most was homemade, crude, and hard as bark. Soft cheese didn't travel, so saloons served what could survive heat. Dry wedges of cheddar, or something labeled cheese, but closer to wax. It was sliced with hunting knives and shared in silence. Mold was scraped off. A little didn't matter. A lot meant you cut deeper. If the cheese stank, you sniffed and shrugged. because cheese that didn't smell was probably fake. Dairy was a gamble. But if you could hold it down, it gave your bones a little strength and your stomach something. Solid to think about. Asterisk. Before pepper, before chili flakes, before ketchup and vinegar, there was salt. It was the one seasoning every saloon relied on, the one mineral no kitchen could afford to ignore. Salt preserved meat, rimmed glasses, covered rot and brought flavor to even the blandest dish. It came in sacks, bricks, or jars, often coarse, unrefined, and gray. It wasn't sprinkled so much as pinched, crushed, or dumped. A cook could disguise a week-old rabbit with enough salt to burn your tongue. Saloon peanuts? So salty they made your lips bleed. Stew tasting flat? Add salt. Bread gone bad? Salt it. It was flavor, preservative, and placebo all in one. But it had a dark side. Too much made men sick. Not enough, and the food turned fast. Salt sores were common on cracked lips and windburned faces. Cowboys carried pouches in their saddlebags. Chefs hoarded it. And gamblers used it to clean wounds after knuckle-dash fights. It didn't just make food better. It kept people alive. Asterisk, if the Wild West had a signature dish, it was stew. It simmered on saloon stoves, bubbled in campfire pots, and filled countless bellies with its strange, ever-changing contents. No two bowls were the same, and that was both a blessing and a warning. Stew was survival. It could stretch meat, disguise age, and make use of leftovers too old to recognize. The base was usually water, thickened with flour, lard, or beans. The rest, that depended on the day. Salt pork, game meat, potatoes, onions if you were lucky, squirrel, rat, or boot leather if you weren't. Cooks added whatever they had. Some stew pots hadn't been emptied in weeks, just refilled. Each ladle carried flavors from days before: smoke, grit, grease, and a hint of regret. Spices were rare, but a pinch of sage or pepper could elevate the whole pot. It was always hot, always thick, and always questionable. The locals called it Cowboy Surprise, and everyone knew why. If you had stew and lived to tell the tale, it was a good day. Asterisk biscuits in the Wild West weren't soft, buttery pillows. They were dense, dry, and often hard enough to chip. Tooth. Made with lard, sour milk, and soda, they were quick to cook over a fire, but slow to chew through. You didn't bite them. You broke them. Sometimes with a rock. The outside was scorched, the inside barely risen. Cooks didn't have time or tools for perfection. Baking powder was a luxury. Eggs were rare. So biscuits came out like lumps of old plaster, heavy, white, and stubborn. But they were filling, and they traveled well in saddlebags wrapped in. Cloth. To soften them, folks dunked them in gravy, stew, or even their coffee. Kids gnawed on them like jerky. Some saloon cooks tried to sell them warm, straight from cast iron pans, but even fresh from the fire. They felt like they'd been baked. A week ago, if a biscuit crumbled, that was a good day. Most didn't. Most just thudded against the table, unbothered by knives or teeth. But they filled a man's belly. And on the trail, that was all that mattered. Asterisk eggs were a rare treat in saloons when you could get them. But more often than not, the ones available had been sitting too long. They came by wagon, bouncing, for miles in the heat, or were gathered from local hens and left unrefrigerated on dusty shelves. When fresh, they were scrambled in lard, cracked into biscuits, or boiled until gray. But when they were bad, and they often were, they let you know. The smell was sulfur sharp, like a punch in the nose. Even cooked, the stench lingered in the room, on your fingers, in your beard. Saloon cooks tested them with water. If it floated, it was bad. If it sank, probably good. But when food was scarce, the test was ignored. You cracked, sniffed, shrugged, and tossed it in the pan. Some eggs were black inside. Some hissed when opened. Still, they were served. Cowboys didn't complain unless they threw up. Even then, they might ask for a second helping, because even a rotten egg was still an egg. And sometimes, the smell of breakfast good or bad was enough to keep a man sane. Asterisk jerky was the Wild West's answer to refrigeration. Strips of meat, salted, dried, and hardened into slabs, tough enough to survive desert heat, saddlebags, or a saloon shelf. But saloon jerky? That was something else entirely. It came in baskets, jars, or simply tied in bundles behind the bar. Often unlabeled, always suspect. The meat could be beef, venison, or bison, but it could also be a horse, raccoon, or something no one dared name. Some strips were peppered, others coated in chili powder or vinegar to disguise the taste. You didn't chew it as much as gnaw it. It hurt your jaw, scraped your gums, and sometimes made your teeth bleed. The best jerky was made by travelers, hunters who sold a few strips for whiskey money. The worst came from back alleys and butchers who used every leftover scrap. Grizzle, sinew, and unidentifiable tissue dried under the sun, slapped with salt, and sold as cowboy chew. But it was protein. And in a land of beans and biscuits, even mystery meat was worth chewing on, as long as it didn't crawl. Asterisk bread in the Wild West didn't come fresh from a bakery. It arrived hard, dry, and often stale enough to be used as a weapon. Saloons bought it in bulk or baked it from flour, so coarse it could scratch your throat. Without preservatives or proper storage, it turned to stone within days. So cooks got creative. They soaked it in broth, milk, coffee, or even beer. Anything to soften it. Sometimes it became a dumpling, sometimes a mush. Other times it was fried in lard and served as slab toast, which was more texture than taste. Bread was bulk. It filled space in an empty stomach. Even when it crumbled like chalk or snapped like bark, it was still served. Guests learned to dunk it quickly and chew with care. If you were lucky, you got cornbread, denser, sweeter, and more forgiving. But even that dried out fast in desert air, and by the third day, it too needed soaking in the saloon. Bread wasn't just a side dish, it was a strategy. Asterisk behind every saloon kitchen was a bucket, not labeled, rarely cleaned. It was filled with grease, bacon drippings, beef fat, leftover lard. A thick, glistening stew of oils that caught every flavor of every meal ever made. This was the saloon's gold mine. Grease was flavor, fuel, and survival. Cooks dipped into it with wooden spoons, slathering it over griddle pans, brushing it onto stale biscuits, or stirring it into bubbling stews. It made everything taste better, or at least made everything taste like something. Fried eggs, beans, potatoes, and mystery meats all owed their texture to the bucket. But it wasn't just food. Grease-polished boots, oiled squeaky hinges, and helped start fires when kindling ran short. Cowboys rubbed it on cracked lips and windburned cheeks. It smelled like comfort, or nausea, depending on the day. By week's end, the grease bucket had taken on a life of its own. New layers added on top of old. Sometimes you found bits of onion, bone, or old bread floating in it. But no one tossed it out. Ever. In the Wild West, the bucket wasn't waste. It was survival in its purest, stickiest form. Asterisk out west, fresh fruit was nearly unheard of. But if you were lucky or paid, well, you might get a bite of something sweet in the form of dried apples. Tough, leathery slices cut thin and sun-dried until they curled at the edges like old parchment. They were stored in sacks, strung in bunches, or sold by the handful from behind the bar. Dried apples tasted like memory. Sweet, sour, chewy, and dry as saddle leather. You'd chew for minutes before flavor bloomed. but they kept. That was the key. Where fresh apples rotted in days, dried apples lasted months, if not years. Even when they collected dust or turned a bit rubbery, they still counted as fruit. Sometimes saloon cooks soaked them in warm water to soften them. Sometimes they tossed them into beans or bread, hoping the sweetness might lift a bland stew. But most often, they were eaten as is, tough little reminders of a world far from dust and drought. A slice of dried apple could make a man think of home, or a mother's pie, or a life that didn't revolve around salt and lard. It didn't last long, but for a moment it was enough. Asterisk floating in murky jars behind nearly every saloon bar. Pickled eggs were the West's version of fine dining, if you could stomach them. Hard-boiled and soaked in vinegar, brine, and sometimes a mystery spice or two, these eggs were a test of courage as much as a snack. They weren't served warm. They weren't served fresh. They were scooped out with stained fingers or metal tongs and slapped onto a plate, still slick and cold. Some were rubbery, others nearly dissolved. The longer they sat in the jar, the more bite they had, and some had been sitting for years. Pickled eggs were cheap protein. They didn't spoil quickly. Cowboys would pop one into their mouth between whiskey shots. Gamblers chewed them slowly, hoping the vinegar would sharpen their senses. No one ever ordered two at once. The smell was unmistakable, sharp, eggy, and a little like regret. But in the hunger-soaked haze of saloon life, pickled eggs stood tall among the options. They were strange. They were sour. But they filled the space where hunger lived, and sometimes that was enough. Asterisk, if there was one food that held the West together, it was beans. Simple, cheap, and filling, beans showed up at every meal and were served in every saloon from Kansas to California. Black beans, pinto, navy, whatever dried legumes a place could get, they'd be boiled to near collapse, seasoned, barely, and shoveled out by the ladle. Mornings began with beans, fried up with last night's grease. Lunch meant a bowl of cold beans with dry bread. Dinner brought hot beans again, often with a chunk of meat or something like it floating near the bottom. The pot was rarely cleaned, just topped up, and topped up again. Layers of flavor, smoke, and time seeped into every bite. They were cheap fuel for hard labor. Loaded with fiber and protein, they kept a cowboy's gut full, though not quietly. Flatulence became part of daily life, joked about between bites. It didn't matter. You were alive. You were fed. Some folks added molasses for a touch of sweetness. Others poured in old coffee or whiskey just to shake things up. But however they were cooked, beans were always there boiling on the back of the stove, smelling of soot and salt and the long ride ahead. Asterisk coffee was the heartbeat of every saloon morning, and often the only thing hot that didn't require chewing. But it wasn't the smooth, roasted blend you know today. Saloon coffee was thick, black as tar, and strong enough to make your eyelids sweat. Beans were ground by hand or crushed with rocks, boiled directly in pots grounds and all over open flames. Eggs were sometimes cracked into the brew to settle the sediment, creating a floating mess of shells and yolk scum. The result? A brew bitter enough to wake the dead dot. It was served in dented tin mugs that scorched your hands. You blew the steam away, took a sip, and braced for the punch. Cowboys downed it before sunrise. Gamblers drank it to stay sharp at midnight. Sometimes it was thick enough to chew. If it sat too long, a film formed on top a skin of grease, dust, or both. But no one poured it out. You just stirred, sniffed, and swallowed. Because in the West, coffee didn't just keep you awake, it reminded you you were alive. Asterisk in the Wild West, whiskey wasn't just a drink, it was a food group. Water couldn't be trusted. Milk was rare. Coffee ran out. But whiskey? Whiskey was always flowing. In saloons from Deadwood to Dodge, it was poured by the shot, by the glass, sometimes by the bucket dot. It wasn't smooth. It wasn't aged. And it sure wasn't fancy. It burned on the way down, scraped your throat raw, and hit your stomach like a hot nail. Some batches were cut with tobacco juice, pepper, kerosene, or turpentine. They called it rot gut for a reason. Still it was. Medicine, a morning eye-opener, a painkiller, a courage builder. Cowboys drank it straight. Gamblers sipped between hands. Cooks even threw it in stews. And if you had a toothache, you swished it. If you had a wound, you poured it. If you had nothing else, you drank it anyway. Some saloons offered it free with meals. Others sold it in wooden thimbles. Either way, it was part of daily life, whether you liked it or not. And if you didn't drink, you still smelled it. In the air, in the food, in the breath of every man who sat beside you. Asterisk sourdough was the working man's bread on the frontier, and no two loaves were alike. Made from flour, water, and wild yeast caught right from the dusty air. This bread could be fluffy one day and flat as a skillet the next. What mattered was that it worked and that it filled you up. The starter lived in a crock or tin, bubbling quietly in the corner of every saloon kitchen. It smelled sour, sharp, and a little like socks. But if it was alive, it meant bread was coming. Dough was mixed by hand, left to rise or not, and thrown into cast iron. The result? A heavy, chewy loaf with a thick crust and a tangy bite. Travelers prized sourdough for its long life. It didn't mold quickly, and the starter could be fed forever. Some cooks gave theirs names. Others swore the starter was older than the saloon itself. When the bread turned out well, it was gold. When it didn't, it still beat eating leather you. Could toast it, soak it in grease, or wipe the last drop of stew from your bowl with it. Either way, it reminded folks of something homemade, even if it tasted like vinegar and grit. Asterisk, there were no golden fries, no crispy chips, just rough cut. Chunks of potato tossed in a cast iron pan with whatever grease the cook had on hand. Fried potatoes were basic, honest food, something even the most meager saloon could whip up. The spuds were never peeled. Dirt clung to the skins, and eyes were only cut out if someone had time, which they often didn't. Sliced thick, tossed in hot fat beef tallow, bacon grease, or lard, and seared until the edges were crispy and brown, if not burned. Seasoning, salt if you were lucky, maybe some black pepper, but usually the flavor came from the pan itself, years of grease, and use cooked into every bite. Potatoes might be served solo, or under a ladle of beans, or next to a fried egg. If you were really fortunate, you got them with onions, their sweetness melting into the crunch. They were hot, heavy, and filling. They didn't spoil. They soaked up whiskey and lined your gut before a long ride. In the West, a plate of fried potatoes was like a handshake from the cook, brief, rough, but unforgettable. Asterisk cornmeal was the great equalizer of the Wild West. Cheap, plentiful, and forgiving, it could be cooked in more ways than a gambler had tricks. In saloons and shanty kitchens, cornmeal became breakfast, lunch, and dinner, depending on what you added, or what you didn't dot at its simplest. It was mush. Water, salt, and cornmeal oiled to a thick paste. Served hot, it stuck to your ribs. Served cold, it stuck to your spoon. But with a little lard, it became hoe cakes, pan-fried discs with crispy edges and a smoky crunch. Add beans or bacon, and suddenly you had a meal worth sitting down for. Grits were another version, thinner, creamier, and often stirred for hours over low flame. Some cooks flavored them with drippings or dashes of sour milk. Others poured molasses over the top, turning them into a strange but welcome dessert. It wasn't about taste. It was about survival. You couldn't always count on meat or vegetables. But if a saloon had cornmeal, it had food. Enough to fill you. Enough to move on. Asterisk butter was a rarity on the frontier. Not because cows didn't exist, but because the heat, the dust, and the lack of cold storage made keeping it nearly impossible. When saloons did have it, it came in small crocks or wrapped in waxed cloth, often yellowed, a little sour, and gone before noon. Most butter was churned far from town and delivered via wagon if it survived the journey. By the time it reached a saloon, it was soft, sometimes rancid, and desperately rationed. A thin smear on bread was considered luxury. A dollop on hot cornmeal mush? Pure decadence. Some saloons tried making their own. Milk from the nearest cow was left to sit until the cream rose, then hand-churned for hours in a barrel, shaken by whatever boy or bartender was least busy. The result wasn't always smooth, but it was precious. It was spread, melted, or hidden away until a paying customer asked for it by name, got to stretch it. Cooks often mixed it with lard or flour. No one complained. Even bad butter was better than none. And when you finally got a bite of real creamy, salty butter melting on hot bread or beans, it was like remembering what food was supposed to taste like. Asterisk cheese in the Wild West wasn't soft, wasn't creamy, and wasn't anything close to fancy. What it was, when you could get it, was tough, sharp, and aged so long it could crumble or crack a tooth. Made from milk that might have turned or traveled too far, cheese was one of the few dairy products that could survive without ice. Saloons stored it in cool corners, or wrapped in cloth, coated with ash, wax, or salt to keep the flies off. The smell was strong, earthy, pungent, sometimes sour, but it paired well with stale bread or fried potatoes and gave the illusion of richness. Even when it was dry as saddle leather, local farmers sometimes traded wedges for whiskey. It came in lumps, rounds, or broken slabs cut by Bowie knives. Some varieties had specks of mold, which cowboys either ignored or scraped off without a word. Others were smoked near the fire, giving them a dark rind and a flavor that lingered. Longer than most conversations. When melted into beans or shaved onto biscuits, it transformed the simplest meals. And when eaten plain, it reminded the eater that even on the edge of civilization, there was still room for flavor rough, rugged, and unforgiving as the land itself. Salt pork was a staple of frontier life, not because it was delicious, but because it lasted. Long slabs of fatty meat cured in coarse salt, sometimes smoked, sometimes not. In saloons, it was boiled, fried, chopped into beans, or served straight from the pan. Still sizzling dot, it was nearly all fat. Meat was a bonus. The salt cured it into a rubbery texture that softened only after long cooking. But it gave everything. It touched a deep, smoky richness. One piece could flavor an entire pot of stew. Two could carry a meal into memory. Cutting it was tough. Your knife had to be sharp and your stomach ready. It smelled strong like brine, smoke, and the open range. Cowboys chewed it slowly, letting the fat melt down their throats. When cooked wrong, it was chewy and harsh. When cooked right, it was survival on a plate. You didn't need much. A few slices with bread or beans could carry a man to the next town. It wasn't just food, it was strategy, calories, salt, and fuel. And every saloon that served it earned the loyalty of men who knew the taste of the trail. Asterisk, when a saloon cook cracked open a tin of tomatoes, the scent alone could turn heads. Sweet, tangy, and faintly metallic, it was the smell of distant cities, rail lines, and food made by someone else. Tinned tomatoes were rare, and when they showed up, they were treated with reverence. Canned goods were a miracle of modern shipping, but expensive. Saloons bought them sparingly, stored them high on pantry shelves, and brought them down only for special dishes or special guests. The tomatoes inside were soft, stewed, sometimes oversalted, but rich with flavor that couldn't be found. On the prairie, cooks mixed them into stews, poured them over beans, or used them to soften stale bread. Just a spoonful brightened the plate. When a tin was opened, the leftover juice was saved and used the next day. Nothing was wasted. Asterisk. Sometimes cowboys stared at the label, marveling at the color print. Some swore they could taste the factory in every bite. Others said reminded them of a home they barely remembered. In a world of salt pork and dry biscuits, tinned tomatoes felt like a visit from the future. Asterisk. Among the shelves of beans and salt pork, one treat stood out for its color, sweetness, and rarity: dried peaches. Brought in by wagon or rail from distant orchards, these leathery, wrinkled slices held the memory of summer. They were sticky, fragrant, and golden orange, glowing in the lantern light like gold dust. Peaches were sliced thin and laid in the sun to dry until they curled and shrank. Packed into cloth bags or wooden crates, they were prized in saloons not just as food but as comfort. Cowboys chewed them slowly during poker games. Bartenders tucked them into whiskey for a sweet kick. Cooks added them to bread or stews, where they plumped back to life like buried treasure. A few saloons made peach whiskey, steeping the dried fruit in rough liquor until the liquid turned amber and smelled like dessert. It wasn't smooth, but it felt fancy. It tasted like something from back east, and for a cowboy far from home, that was more than enough. You didn't eat dried peaches fast. You let them sit on your tongue and soften. You closed your eyes. For a few minutes, you weren't in a dusty saloon or a mud-choked camp. You were somewhere warm, sweet, and safe. Asterisk. Before refrigeration, before canned meat, there was jerky. Strips of beef, buffalo, or venison cut thin, salted heavily, and left to dry in the sun until they were as stiff as wood and twice as hard to chew. If you were riding the range or passing through a saloon in the late 1800s, chances are a piece of jerky was tucked into your saddlebag or jacket pocket. It was food that didn't spoil, didn't need fire, and didn't attract flies most of the time. It tasted of smoke, salt, and iron, with a texture that could challenge even the strongest jaw. Cowboys chewed it for minutes before it softened, their teeth grinding away like they were working leather. But jerky filled the belly and stayed. There, saloon keepers kept jars of it behind the bar, selling it by the strip or tossing it in free with a drink. Some varieties were spiced with red pepper or rubbed with molasses before drying. Others were plain just meat and thyme. No two batches ever tasted the same. If you were lucky, the jerky came from beef. If you weren't, it might have come from something wild, something mysterious, something unmentioned, but it kept you alive. And in the Wild West, that counted more than flavor. Out on the frontier, stew was less about the recipe and more about what you could find. In the saloons, cooks threw everything into the pot: rabbit, squirrel, prairie chicken, venison, or even raccoon. If it moved and could be caught, it found its way into stew. The result was a bubbling pot of aroma and guesswork. The base was always the same: water, beans or barley if available, and whatever meat had been trapped, traded, or scraped off bone. Vegetables, when they existed, were diced fine and stretched. Far, carrots, onions, or wild greens might float at the surface, soft from hours of boiling. Bones were left in, partly for flavor, partly because no one had time to pull them out. This wasn't dainty food. It was murky, brown, and thick as tar. It steamed up into your eyes and clung to your beard. You never knew exactly what you were eating, but it was hot, filling, and deeply satisfying after a cold ride or a long day, The smell alone could stop a man in the doorway. And even if you had to pick out bits of fur or gristle, it was still stew. And in a Wild West saloon, that meant hope in a bowl. Asterisk, when meat was scarce and bread turned stale, pickles brought a spark to a plate. Saloon kitchens stored barrels of sour cucumbers, floating in cloudy brine, spiced with garlic, mustard seeds, and whatever else the cook had lying around. They weren't delicate, they were sharp, crunchy, and puckered your mouth with every bite. The pickles served in the West were often homemade, fermented long in wooden casks that sat in cool corners of kitchens or cellars. Some were sliced into thick rounds and served with slabs of cheese. Others were whole, slapped onto plates beside fried potatoes or cold beans. The vinegar was strong, bordering on caustic. Cowboys didn't nibble. They crunched, winced, and washed the flavor down. With whiskey, pickles cut through the fat and salt of every other food on the table. They were acidic, alive, and fierce. They woke you up. Some bartenders even used the brine in drinks, adding a splash to cheap whiskey or warm beer to create something called cowboy tonic. Whether it worked or not, no one asked. They just drank and hoped for the best. Asterisk biscuits. In the Wild West were not the fluffy clouds of modern breakfast tables. They were dense, dry, and sometimes as hard as the table they were served on. Made from flour, lard, water, and a pinch of baking soda, these biscuits were cooked in cast iron pans or directly on hot stones in the saloon hearth. There was no butter, no jelly. If you were lucky, you got gravy thin, salty, and made from the drippings of something fried that morning. Cowboys dunked biscuits in coffee or stew to soften them. Chewing them dry could leave your mouth stuck halfway shut, yet they were reliable. They didn't spoil quickly. They were easy to make in batches and filled up a man's stomach with little effort. The dough was slapped together without precision rough circles cut from cans, thrown into pans, and baked until the tops browned and the bottoms blackened. Sometimes, a cook would sprinkle in bits of pork crackling, dried herbs, or pepper. But most of the time, the flavor came from the hunger you brought with you. And that was enough to make even the driest biscuit taste like home. Asterisk, before dawn in dusty saloon kitchens, a battered skillet would hiss as ladles of slapjack batter hit. The heat. Slapjacks, the rugged ancestor of pancakes, were made from flour, water, and lard, or whatever scraps the cook had on hand. The batter was thin, the edges crispy, and the taste somewhere between fried bread and frontier desperation. They were fast to make, easy to flip, and could stretch far. Cooks often fried them directly in pork grease, giving the slapjacks a salty, smoky flavor that stuck in the mouth. Stacked 3 high, they were served with beans, coffee, or sometimes just air. When syrup wasn't available, molasses was the stand-in. If even that was missing, a drizzle of bacon fat did the trick. Some called them flapjacks. Others called them journey cakes or camp pancakes. But no matter the name, they were a breakfast that worked. Rough, hot, and fast like most things in the West, they soaked up coffee, comforted empty stomachs, and gave cowboy asterisk beans with a backbone of frontier meals. Simple, reliable, and filling, they could be cooked in one pot and left to simmer all day. Every saloon had a pot of beans on the stove. Black beans, pinto, or navy whatever could be found in bulk and stored through the seasons. They were soaked overnight and boiled over low flame with fatback, salt, or chunks of old salt pork. When meat was short, a bone was tossed in for flavor. Spices were rare, but an onion or dried chili might find its way in. What mattered was heat, time, and patience. The beans thickened with every hour, turning from broth to stew. Cowboys spooned them into tin bowls, ate them on hard biscuits, or folded them into slapjacks. Leftovers were served cold or reheated the next day thicker, darker, and even more satisfying. They were cheap, easy to store, and hearty. A man could ride all morning on a belly full of beans. And in a world that took more than it gave, beans were a small mercy that tasted better with every mile. Asterisk in the saloon kitchens of the Wild West, coffee wasn't just a beverage. It was a ritual, a requirement, a coping mechanism. Brewed in battered tin pots over open flames, it was thick, black, and bitter enough to make your teeth tingle. There were no filters, no fancy beans. Just coarse grounds scooped by hand into boiling water, often with a pinch of salt or crushed. Eggshells tossed in to settle the grit. The longer it boiled, the stronger it got. Some saloons let it simmer all day, adding more water and grounds until the brew was nearly solid. Cowboys drank it at dawn, noon, and dusk. It was poured into dented tin cups, sipped while standing, and sloshed down between bites of beans or biscuits. It fueled card games, quiet conversations, and long rides into the desert. Even if it tasted like scorched dirt and rust, it was warm. It was familiar. It was home in a cup. Old-timers claimed it was strong enough to float a horseshoe. And though most wouldn't admit it, a second cup meant a second wind, something everyone needed after a night of bad sleep and worse whiskey. Asterisk, it wasn't food, exactly. But a bottle of pepper sauce on the table meant something: heat, bite, and the illusion of flavor where none existed. In a saloon where the beans were bland and the salt pork was old, that sharp splash of vinegar and red pepper was salvation. Homemade or brought in by wagon, the sauce was often little more than crushed. Chilies steeped in cider vinegar. Some had garlic, others had sugar or mustard seed. Most were stored in reused whiskey bottles, corked with a plug of rag. The glass fogged with age and heat. Cowboys doused everything in it: beans, eggs, biscuits, even fried potatoes. It covered. The taste of old meat brought tears to the eyes and cleared the sinuses faster than a dust storm. And when fights broke out in the saloon, the bottle sometimes did double duty as a weapon. The pepper sauce gave food a soul. It turned the same old stew into something new. It reminded a man that life still had kick, still had color, even out here where everything felt sunburned and gray. Asterisk, asterisk. Dessert wasn't a promise in the Wild West. It was a surprise. And when it appeared, it usually came in the form of a single, slightly wilted slice of pie. Apple if you were lucky, dried peach more often, and whatever fruit could be found, or preserved if you weren't picky. Saloons didn't have fresh cream or delicate pastry chefs. Pie crusts were thick and hard, baked in cast iron and cut with a cleaver. The filling was syrupy, sometimes overcooked, sometimes under. Sugar was rare, and hoarded pies were often sweetened with molasses or sorghum. These weren't bakery-perfect slices. The tops were cracked, the bottoms soggy. But after weeks of beans and biscuits, even a lopsided wedge of fruit and crust felt like celebration. It meant the cook had tried. It meant someone thought you might need a little comfort at the end of your meal. Some pies had spices, a pinch of cinnamon or clove from a jar buried deep on a back shelf. Others just had the flavor of whatever was canned, dried, or found. Either way, pie brought quiet to a saloon. For a few bites, nobody talked. They just remembered what sweetness felt like. When cowboys hit the trail, they didn't carry sandwiches. They packed corn dodgers. These dense, hand-formed cakes of cornmeal. Water and bacon grease were baked until hard on the outside and chewy within. Shaped like thick nuggets or patties, dodgers were food you could hold in your hand and keep in your saddlebag for days. They were cheap to make and built to last. Unlike biscuits, they didn't crumble. Unlike jerky, they didn't tear your jaw. Apart, they could be eaten cold, dipped in beans, or washed down with coffee. Most tasted like grit and grease, but a hot dodger fresh off the fire could surprise you with its smoky depth. Saloon cooks often made them in batches and left them on a plate near the stove. Travelers would grab a few, wrap them in cloth, and be gone. Sometimes they were sweetened slightly with molasses or bits of dried apple. Other times they were just pure grit and heat, made to sit like a stone in your stomach and get you through the next stretch of dust and wind you didn't love. Corn dodgers. But you trusted them. And out west, trust was as close to comfort as you got. Asterisk, sometimes the saloon pantry was bare, the deliveries late, and the game traps empty. On those days, cooks turned to the ground itself, gathering dandelion greens from the dusty edges of town or the cracks between rocks near a stream. Bitter, tough, and sharp on the tongue, these wild leaves became the poor man's vegetable. They were washed in cold well water and boiled to soften the bite, though the bitterness never fully left. Tossed with a little salt pork grease or vinegar, they were served warm beside beans or mashed potatoes. Occasionally, they were cooked with onions or flavored with the last splash of pepper sauce from the bottom of the bottle. Dandelion greens weren't glamorous. They were survival food. They reminded you that when the wagons didn't roll in and the meat went bad, nature still had something to offer. You just had to know where to look and be hungry enough to try it. Cattlemen grumbled. Drunks turned their noses up. But those who knew the land chewed slowly and said nothing. Because in a place where the sky burned and the wind bit, dandelion greens meant one more day fed. Asterisk, as the long day came to an end in the dust-choked towns of the American frontier, saloons didn't dim the lights or call for last orders like in modern times. Instead, the flicker of oil lamps and the slow scrape of chairs across warped floorboards signaled the closing rhythm of the town's heartbeat. The final meal of the day wasn't grand. It wasn't even hot. In most cases, it might be a leftover biscuit soaked in weak coffee, or a tin bowl of bean mash left crusting near the stove. For those who couldn't afford another drink, food was the cheapest way to sit for a while, longer in the company of voices and heat. No one asked for menus. There were none. No one asked what time it was. Time was a luxury. For many cowboys, miners, drifters, and laborers, meals were the only measure of their days, something to break the monotony between rides, fights, and sleep. And when the plates were scraped clean and the mugs wiped out with dirty cloths, silence returned. The saloon quieted. Empty chairs leaned into one another like drunks in confession. Food was never glamorous and rarely good, but it was always present. A final gesture of survival at the end of another long-forgotten day in a town that might not exist a year from now. These meals weren't about nourishment. They were punctuation marks, closing lines to long, gritty sentences written in dust, sweat, and the taste of whatever could be cooked in one pot. As the sun sets over the dusty plains and the saloon doors creak shut behind the last weary traveler, we are left with a quiet truth. The Wild West wasn't the place of legends and luxury. It was a land of survival, grit, and simple sustenance. The food, like the people, was tough, plain, and sometimes questionable, a reflection of a harsh world where comfort was a stranger, and every meal was a small victory. From rancid butter to mystery meat stews, every bite tells a story of endurance and the raw realities behind the myths. Thank you for joining me on this slow journey through the rough edges of history, the forgotten flavors and forgotten struggles that shaped a wild frontier. If you enjoyed this dive into the past, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe, and hit the bell for more quiet stories that might just keep you awake or help you sleep better. Until next time, rest easy. And remember, history isn't always pretty, but it's always real. Asterisk,